What's up guys, Todd Kelly, Shuswap Outdoors here. I'm on day 2 of butchering a moose that I shot last week, and I thought I'd just go over the tools and equipment I use for processing an animal at home. I'm not going to go into any details on how to break down an animal. There's already a ton of great videos by butchers on how to do it properly. So if you're into that, I would search for the Bearded Butchers. They have some of the best YouTube videos on breaking down animals. I'm just going to cover the stuff I've learned over the last 20 years of processing animals at home. So first off is a cutting board. You'll want a bigger size cutting board than your typical one you use for your everyday cooking. You're going to be dealing with bigger cuts of meat, so you'll want something a little larger. I would say mine's on the small side. If I were to buy a new one right now, I would go for 3 feet by 2 feet, but I wouldn't go any smaller than like a 2 foot by 2 foot one. The pieces of meat you're going to be dealing with are way bigger than your average cooking stuff. Doesn't matter if it's wood or plastic, something good quality is a must-have. Obviously the most important part of this whole process is your knife, and you only need one knife. You don't need 10 knives for breaking down an animal. A good boning knife is all you need. I prefer one that's curved with a little bit of flex but not too much. And when I say a good boning knife, that doesn't mean it's expensive. You can get really good boning knives for $25 to $60. You don't have to spend $100 plus on a boning knife. These ones I think are about $45 and they're really good. You'll need to keep this thing sharp as well. You can use stones, steels. I use an electric knife sharpener because this is what I have. I use it for my everyday kitchen knives. It's super fast, puts a really good edge on it. But you will need something to keep this thing sharp because you will be touching it up every 5 to 10 minutes in this process. Next thing is you'll need a place to put your meat. I bought some meat tubs at the very beginning of doing my own butchering. Super handy. I like turning the lid 90 degrees on the tub, and I have it set up here in front of me. And when I'm working on meat, the trimmings go into the tub to get ground later, and all the cuts of meat go up here on the lid. And when the lid gets full of meat, I can pass this off to get wrapped. I can get another empty lid, put it up here, and then I can load this one up. This system works really good. It's fast, it's convenient, especially when you have someone else helping you wrap your meat for you. But you will need a place to put your trimmings at the minimum. You can use bowls or stuff like that as well. But these meat tubs are fantastic. One of the best ways to get kids and new people into eating wild game is doing breaded tenderized cuts. And I like doing the tenderizing now instead of pulling out steaks out of the freezer and doing it while I'm cooking. For this I use a meat hammer. Super convenient. I have it here on my side, and when I want to do a tenderized piece of meat, I pound it out and then put it onto my lid here. You can buy tenderizing attachments that go onto grinders or standalone units, but I've just found that's an extra expense, something else you got to clean and store and deal with in this process, while it can all be solved by a $5 meat hammer. If you do tenderized types of meats or hamburgers, you'll need to separate them or else they become a mess when you thaw them out of the freezer. I used to buy big rolls of wax paper and cut them with scissors, but that became very time consuming and a bit of a pain. So I use these pre-made patty papers. You get 1,000 of them for about $20, $25. Super convenient. When I'm doing tenderized pieces of meat, I just pull one out and stack them up on my lid here, keeping them separated. Super convenient. And like I said, I also do them for hamburger patties when I make up hamburger patties. This box has lasted about 5 years. Obviously depends on how much meat you do, but those things are worth their money. Another nice thing to have, but you don't need, is a bone saw. I don't do any bone-in cuts of meat, personally. I cut up my bones for our dog. I cut 6-inch sections. We throw them in the freezer and we pull them out throughout the year as treats for our dog. But if you're into doing bone broth, bone-in cuts, or bone marrow, you will need some sort of bone saw. These Wyoming breakdown saws are fantastic. I carry this in the bush with me as well. multi-purpose, super nice. You don't have to get a standalone bone saw. Personally, I would get a multi-purpose one that you can use for other stuff. Really nice to have. One of the worst things you can do when giving people meat is giving them stuff with hair on it. And I know we all try to keep our meat as clean as possible, but you always end up with a couple loose hairs here and there. You can pick them off with your hands, but I find over time your hands get sticky and it can become hard to pull hairs off, or you pull them off and they stick to your hand and you don't realize it and you end up transferring the hair back. So when I get my meat onto my cutting board, I quickly blowtorch over top of them just fast enough to zap the hairs, and it doesn't affect the meat at all. Some people also do this while the meat's hanging up and try to blast all the hairs off, but having a blowtorch is fantastic for doing that. I also like having a garbage can right next to me. There is a fair bit of trimmings that go into the garbage with the sinew and stuff like that, so a garbage can right next to you is really handy to do. The next thing I'll show is I'll clear this off and I'll go over what I use for my grinder and packaging my meat. So for packaging my meat, I like using saran wrap and good old freezer paper. I've tried using vacuum bags, but I didn't like it. There's a couple big drawbacks of using them. First off is the cost. If you're going to do a moose, an elk, caribou, you're going to go through a ton of these and it gets expensive fairly quickly. Second thing I didn't like about using the vacuum bags was if you get a tiny little hole in it and you don't realize it, your meat's going to get freezer burnt fairly quickly. And when you have your meat in your freezer and you're rooting around looking for something and the bags are banging against each other, they can put a microscopic hole in it, and over a week time it loses its seal, and a couple months down the road it's freezer burnt. So a big drawback of that. The last thing I really didn't like about using these vacuum bags was they were time consuming. When you're creating the vacuum in the bag, it's pulling moisture out of the meat, and that moisture migrates up towards where the bag gets sealed. And if any moisture gets in that seal, it's not going to be sealed properly. Sometimes you know it as soon as it releases, air goes back in right away, but sometimes you don't. And you could put the bag into the freezer, you think it's sealed, but once again, a week down the road, air's migrated through that tiny little hole and your meat will get freezer burned. So didn't really like using these things at all. When I wrap my meat with saran wrap, I like pulling out a big chunk of saran wrap. I lay my meat down and I'll fold it 4, 5, 6 times so that there's multiple layers of saran wrap covering the meat. And I press really tight to make sure all the air is out, and there's no chance of getting freezer burn. The freezer paper is more or less to protect your saran wrap. And I've had steaks that have been 5, 6 years old that I found at the bottom of the freezer, and you pull them out and they look like they've been in there for a month. So when you do it properly with saran wrap, not only is it cheaper, faster, it has a superior product in my opinion compared to using the vacuum bags. Labeling, everyone starts off with a Sharpie marker. These things are fantastic, a little time consuming. So I liked switching over to stamps. We got the most common cuts of meat and animals that we do and had them made into stamps. So it's really nice to have it laid out. You got 15 packs of steaks, get some ink on it, and you pound through them like nothing compared to writing with a Jiffy marker. I also have a date stamp with the date of the kill on it and stamp all our bags or packages of meat with that. A nice to have thing, but a Jiffy marker works. If you're using freezer paper, make sure you buy freezer tape. Masking tape and painter's tape, the adhesive will slowly let go over time in your freezer, undoing your packages. So the freezer tape has a special adhesive that stays sticky in the cold of your freezer and won't let go. So make sure you buy the right type of tape. As for meat grinders, don't waste your money with the cheap $150, $200 Canadian Tire ones. You're just going to be frustrated and not enjoy the process. These things are fairly expensive, but if you look at the cost of getting a deer processed, there's only 2 or 3 deer sitting here in a grinder. This is a Lem 3/4 horse, all metal gears. It eats through the meat like crazy. There's a bunch of good brands out right now, so definitely invest in a good meat grinder. And after a few times, if you're not into processing it, sell it. You'll get your money back out of it. I like using these plastic bags for my ground meat. You get about 100 of them for $7. I put on a sausage stuffing horn. You put the bag in, you feed your meat through, the bag fills up so you can keep it airtight. Twist it and you feed it through a little bag sealer, puts a piece of tape around in it, and that's the best way I've found for doing ground meat. Eventually, most people end up getting to sausage making. For the first few times, using your grinder is okay, but it will be time consuming and can be frustrating pushing ground meat through a meat grinder for sausages. So if you end up getting into sausages, it's worthwhile investing into an actual sausage stuffer. I've got an 11-pound horizontal one from Lem, and it will rip through 11 pounds of meat in a minute. Where if I tried doing that same amount of meat in my grinder, even though this is a really good grinder, it'll take 15 minutes to do, if not longer. So if you're wanting to get sausages, look at getting a sausage stuffer as well. Anyways, hopefully this helped you out figuring out what you need for equipment. Keep it super basic. You don't need a bunch of fancy stuff for butchering your own meat. It's a nice thing to do when you have control of everything. You go out, you do the killing in the field, you bring it back, and butchering it yourself is so satisfying, having that whole thing in-house, doing it yourself. Anyways, if you have any questions, put it in the comments below. I'm always checking those. Like the video, that really helps everything out. And if you're into more types of videos like this, please subscribe. Anyways, thanks for watching.